Hello everyone, welcome back to Classical Archaeology. In this video, we're going to discuss some of the civilizations that came in contact with the Romans and that had a major impact on the development of the Roman civilization, the Roman culture, and the course of Roman history. The first civilization we're going to discuss was on the Italian peninsula with the Romans. They're called the Etruscans. After that, we're going to discuss a civilization, or rather a collection of peoples, to the north of the Romans, called the Celts. And then finally, we'll conclude the video by discussing a civilization to the south, the Carthaginians. Before I move on, though, I should add that the Greeks influenced the Romans as well, something we've discussed in previous lecture videos. The Greeks were neighbors of the Romans, both in Sicily and on the Italian peninsula, what was called Magna Graecia, or Greater Greece, because of the large Greek population in the southern Italian peninsula. The Romans also had contact with the Greek mainland across the Adriatic Sea. Greek culture, art, and architecture would inspire the Romans both directly through their interactions with the Greeks, and then indirectly as the Romans interacted with other civilizations that had elements of Greek culture, most notably the Etruscans. And the image on this slide is of the Greek temple to Concordia, the goddess of order. This temple was built from about 430 to 420 BCE, and it was built in Sicily. And of course, as the Romans adopted elements of Greek culture, they made their own changes and modifications, as did the Etruscans, who we're going to discuss in a moment. We'll briefly discuss the origins of the Etruscan civilization from about the 900s BC. The exact origins of the Etruscan civilization are debated. It's believed they came from a group of people called the Proto-Villanovan culture. The Proto-Villanovan culture was a Bronze Age civilization that lived in northern Italy, what is now roughly Tuscany. By the way, the term Tuscany comes from Etruscan. The similarities between the Villanovans and the Etruscans have been established through archaeological discoveries. As Villanovan culture changed and evolved, it became the Etruscan culture. Turning points between Villanovan and Etruscan were the adoption of iron working and iron tools, as well as cremation of the dead. Villanovan culture was less influenced by the Greeks than the later Etruscan culture would be. If anything, the Villanovan culture had more similarities with cultures to the north, like the Celts. And the image on this slide is a bronze Villanovan helmet from about the 900s BCE. The Etruscans would make helmets like this, but over time, much of their metallurgy would become more like that of the Greeks and other Mediterranean civilizations to the south, rather than cultures to the north, as was the case with the older Villanovan people. Here are some just general points about Etruscan society. The Etruscans socially were very similar to contemporary Greeks, or the Greeks at the same time in history. The Etruscan people were not a single country or nation or empire. Rather, they were a fairly loose confederation of city-states in northern Italy. And they did expand their cultural territory over time, though. The Etruscan expansion south into Latin territory, the Latins being the forebearers of the Romans, occurs around the 750s to 500s BCE, which actually coincides with the historical founding of the city of Rome in 753 BCE. So it's possible that the city of Rome may have been founded as the Latin people tried to establish more secure settlements to fend off the Etruscan invasion from the north. And of course, as I want to emphasize again, much of the Romans' knowledge of Greek culture came indirectly or secondhand through the Etruscans, although the Latins, the people who became the Romans, also had contact with Greeks to the south in this region. So they were getting direct Greek culture from the south and indirect Greek culture via the Etruscans from the north, which is one of many reasons why there's so many similarities between Greek and Roman culture. Now we'll discuss the Etruscan language. The Etruscan alphabet is heavily based on the Greek alphabet, and scholars generally regard the Etruscan alphabet as an intermediary between the Greek alphabet and the later Latin or Roman alphabet, which, by looking at the diagrams on the slide, you can see how Greek comes before, Etruscan comes in the middle, and then Latin comes later. Even though we have the Etruscan alphabet and we have the Greek and the Latin/Roman alphabets, scholars have not been able to fully translate the Etruscan language. They've translated some words, but they haven't found a Etruscan Rosetta Stone, a document or artifact with Etruscan text and then Latin or Greek text next to it that could be used to directly translate the Etruscans' language. Additionally, there's not many very large Etruscan inscriptions or writings, at least they haven't been found yet. And you really need to have long documents in order to translate, and decipher a language. This stele here, which is written in Etruscan, is kind of an oddity. Usually, Etruscan inscriptions that have been found are 1 or 2 sentences long, very short, not quite enough for scholars to use to fully translate a language. This is the Tomb of the Leopards in Tarquinia, in the northern part of Etruscan territory. And the Etruscans built very elaborate and richly decorated tombs, as you can see. These paintings are a type of fresco, although the Etruscans also made dry paintings as well. Remember, frescoes are painted into wet, fresh plaster. As the wet, fresh plaster dries, it preserves the paint a lot better than a painting done on a dry surface. So when you see an Etruscan painting that is very well preserved, usually it's because it's a fresco. Other paintings that are much more faded or chipped were probably painted dry, or rather onto a dry surface. Interesting observations we can make about Etruscan paintings is that they're very similar in style to Greek paintings from the same period. Like a lot of Greek paintings, they portray men with darker skin, although sometimes men are portrayed with lighter skin as well. So there's some difference between Greek and Etruscan paintings, but a lot of the scenes are very similar to scenes from Greek paintings at the same time. This tomb painting, which is actually of a Etruscan funerary banquet, is very similar to contemporary paintings done of Greek symposia or symposiums, which are basically ancient Greek parties where men drank a lot of alcohol. Nowadays, when we hear the word symposium, we think of an academic conference. It's very stuffy and very formal. But for the Greeks, a symposium was a wild party. And for the Etruscans, funerary banquets were not somber affairs. They were celebrations of the life of the deceased in which Large amounts of alcohol were consumed, food would have been eaten, and then there would have been dancing and music as well. So they were basically very wild funeral parties. A lot like, say, a New Orleans style funeral today, but even more exuberant. So we'll make some notes about Etruscan culture as seen through its art. Um, it was said that Etruscan society was very hedonistic and it was focused on pleasure and comfort above all else. Now, we've heard this from Roman and Greek historians, especially Roman historians, but the Romans would have been very biased against the Etruscans because early on in Roman history, the Etruscans would have been rivals on the Italian peninsula, and then eventually the Romans are going to take over and basically acculturate the Etruscan people. So they're going to want to make the Etruscans sound selfish, pleasure-seeking, perhaps much more so than they actually were. Although I think there is some archaeological evidence that suggests that the Etruscan society did privilege pleasure seeking. It probably wasn't the most important thing of their society, but it certainly would have been an important part of Etruscan culture. But Roman historians talking about the Etruscans used to say very outlandish things about Etruscan civilization. They used to say things like, in the Etruscan city-states, it was illegal to own roosters because roosters would crow in the morning and wake people up too early. Things that, to a modern reader, really sound pretty absurd, but make sense from the Roman context as the Romans tried to show that the Etruscans were weak compared to the Romans. But I do want to emphasize there was elements of pleasure seeking in the Etruscan culture, and their art shows that. The tomb paintings, like the one on the previous slide, and on this slide as well, show a culture that prioritized music, feasting, dancing, entertainment, even in funerals. What's interesting as well is that Etruscan art and sculpture depicts both women and men together, and often in embrace, highlighting their culture's notions of sexuality. It's also believed that Etruscan culture was less patriarchal than many other ancient Mediterranean cultures, and that women would have had comparatively more power and authority in Etruscan society. But scholars, of course, debate this point because we have archaeological and material evidence, but we don't have any documentary evidence really written by the Etruscans themselves. Any kind of documentary evidence, written evidence we have is written by especially the Romans, and it's written much later, and there's often a bias to it. We'll talk more about Etruscan women a little bit later in this video. This is probably one of the most famous Etruscan artifacts. It's the sarcophagus of the spouses. It's from about the 500s BCE. This sarcophagus is life-sized. It's about 6 feet long and about 3 feet wide, or 2 meters long and 1 meter wide in the metric system. It's made of terracotta, and the figures, the man and the woman on the reclining on the couch. This is obviously a very Greek position, reclining on a couch like this. Once again, showing the Greek influence in Etruscan culture. These figures, as I mentioned, are carved in what is called the Orientalizing style. We talked about the Orientalizing style in our unit on archaic Greece. The facial features and the hairstyles are of the Orientalizing tradition. The man and the woman have slightly almond-shaped eyes. The style of the man's hair and beard is classically of the Orientalizing style. By the 500s BCE, the Greeks had begun to move away from the Orientalizing style and had begun to experiment more and develop their own sculpture styles, the classical style we call it. But it takes time for new ideas and new art styles to diffuse. So by the 500s and even beyond the 500s, the Etruscans were still using the Orientalizing style in their sculpture. A couple more things to note about this sarcophagus. It would not have held the bodies directly of the dead. Rather, it would have held their cremated ashes. As I mentioned, the Etruscans preferred cremation as their method for dealing with the bodies of the deceased. The sarcophagus actually would have opened here at this crack. This crack is a seam, and the sarcophagus actually is in four pieces. 1, 2, 3, 4. And the idea would have been that one of the spouses would have died, his or her ashes would have been placed in this sarcophagus, and then when the other spouse died, their ashes would join those of their partner. And this type of sarcophagus, this one is probably made more for a wealthier couple. So we believe that Etruscan society was socially stratified with a clear kind of wealthy elite class that could afford fancy tombs and fancy sarcophagi, and then a poorer class that had much cheaper tombs and much simpler sarcophagi. We'll talk about some of the less expensive sarcophagi in a moment. But the workmanship on this sarcophagus is very, very skilled, shows a high level of sophistication. The sarcophagi of poorer people, the workmanship is not as good, and the materials were cheaper. They're not made from terracotta. They're made from cheaper types of stone or just from wood. And so they're generally not as well preserved as this sarcophagus. Lastly, the evidence shows that this sarcophagus probably would have been painted as well. The Etruscans were skilled painters, and sculpture in this period, Greek sculpture, was typically painted in this period as well. The Etruscans would have copied the Greeks in that regard. Here are some additional images of the sarcophagus of the spouses. You can see the skilled workmanship on the husband or the male's feet, and you can see that the woman or the wife, the female, is wearing a pair of almost like pointy shoes. We see this type of shoe on women in the Etruscan culture and in Etruscan art. Here are four pieces of a different sarcophagus, but it gives you an idea of how this sarcophagus would have fit together. By the way, this is not the original. This is a reproduction. It's in the Louvre. The original, which I showed on the previous slide, is in Italy. And the reproduction, of course, has been painted to show what the sarcophagus would have looked like in Etruscan times. Here are some less expensive sarcophagi. They're much smaller, only a couple of feet in size. It's also possible that these smaller, cheaper sarcophagi may have been made for children. But the workmanship is still interesting and they're still worth studying. And once again, it highlights that Etruscan society had a degree of social stratification with an elite class that could afford much nicer grave goods and a poorer class that emulated the aristocracy, but what they had was a lot less expensive. This is an example of a later Etruscan sarcophagus, probably from perhaps the 400s to 300s BCE, and it shows a woman in recline in a much more classical Greek style of sculpture. This is not the Orientalizing style. And it shows that the Etruscans were trying to keep up with the Greeks, but they were usually 100 or 200 years behind. You know, it takes time for these ideas to diffuse, but this is a sculpture of a sarcophagus of a woman, and she's arrayed in very fine clothing. The workmanship is very good. It once again highlights that the Etruscan society may have been less patriarchal. Women may have had more power and influence in Etruscan society, as shown by the rich artifacts made for women. A little bit more discussion about Etruscan tombs. Unlike the Greeks, their neighbors across the Adriatic Sea, the Etruscans liked to build very nice, very extensive tombs. Wealthier people would have painted the interiors of their tombs with varieties of paintings and frescoes, and they would have had very nice sarcophagi like the ones we looked at on the previous slides. So they're adopting some elements of Greek culture, but they're also making their own traditions. Remember, the Greeks in the Archaic and the Classical period did not like to build large, extensive tombs. They thought tombs like that were impure, and it's not really until the Hellenistic period that you see big, extravagant tombs being built as Greek society becomes more socially stratified. The Etruscans built large family tombs as well. These would have been multiple family members would have been buried in these tombs. Remember, the Etruscans preferred to practice cremation rather than just burial of bodies. Poorer people would have been buried in smaller, plainer tombs or simply on the ground. Some poorer people who had at least a little bit of money might have buried themselves in a sarcophagus, like the ones we looked at on the previous slides. The less expensive sarcophagi, of course. And this is just another. This image is of the Triclinian tomb in Tarquinia, which is in northern Italy. And one other thing that's interesting is the Etruscans, they like to build their tombs together. They didn't just build their tombs in random places, they built them in what were called necropolises. Necropolis means city of the dead, necro for dead, polis for city. It's a Greek term, and the later Romans will build necropolises as well. And of course, later Greeks will build necropolises, but I think that's all we need to discuss right now for Greek and Roman tombs. We'll get back to Etruscan tombs now. Here are some exteriors of Etruscan tombs. These are larger Etruscan tombs that would have been built more for wealthier people. I think they look like a fusion of Mycenaean Greek tholos tombs, the dome-shaped tombs that the Mycenaeans built, which we talked about in a previous video, especially their entrances. I mean, these tombs are much smaller than the tholos tombs, but they also remind me a little bit of earthen barrow tombs, which were built by the people of Northern Europe, especially the Celts. So you're seeing there's a little bit of fusion of Mediterranean and Northern European ideas in the Etruscan tombs. Remember, the Etruscans, before they were the Etruscans, they were the Villanova people, who had more in common with Northern Europeans than they did with Mediterranean Europeans. So you can kind of see a fusion of styles in the exterior of these tombs. Here's another Etruscan tomb. This one is also, it's built in a fusion of styles. You can see the entrance with its corbel arch looks a lot like a Tholos tomb, but a much smaller version. And then the earthen top is very reminiscent of a barrow. This is just a aerial shot of a Etruscan necropolis. You can see the larger tombs in the bottom of the image. And then there's much smaller tombs which would have been used by poorer people who could not afford such a large burial site, such a large mausoleum or tomb for themselves. Also, these larger tombs probably would have been family tombs as well. Multiple individuals would have been interred in them. So now we'll talk a little bit about what we know of Etruscan funerary rituals. Keep in mind, we have not fully deciphered the Etruscan language. We're reading the material culture as archaeologists. We know that Greek funerals were somber affairs, featuring things like processions through the city, people wearing dark colors. But Etruscan funerals were much more celebratory affairs. They were celebrations of the dead. They featured music, dancing, feasting, consumption of wine and alcohol. It's a highlight of the more pleasure-seeking nature of Etruscan culture. It's also a sign they may have believed in venerating and perhaps even worshiping the dead. And the image on this slide is a carved slab showing a Etruscan funerary banquet. And it's from, of course, Italy as well. Here's some more Etruscan funerary paintings. We see musicians in this slide. The musicians are playing Greek instruments. This is a aulos flute. That's spelled A-U-L-O-S. And then there's a lyre, L-Y-R-E, which is a type of, similar to a harp, play a stringed instrument popular with the Greeks. This individual, this young male, is holding basically a wine glass. The Greeks liked very shallow wine glasses that were more like bowls. And it would seem that the Etruscans copied the Greeks, not only on their musical instruments, but on the vessels from which they consumed wine. So now we'll talk about Etruscan clothing and fashion as shown by their artwork. We think because the Etruscan culture put an emphasis on pleasure seeking, Etruscan clothing was looser and more colorful than that worn by the Greeks. It still has some similarities to Greek clothing, but you see that Etruscan clothing, when it's portrayed, it's always portrayed as being brighter, looser, with very often complex patterns. Men's tunics were very revealing, and actually are in many ways similar more to a Roman toga from centuries later than they are to a Greek tunic. Etruscan women's clothing is a bit more like Greek clothing, but again, it's much more colorful, and the patterns are more complex, highlighting that this culture is not taking itself too seriously. Now we can discuss the Etruscan pantheon, their religion. They were polytheistic, like the Greeks and the Romans later on. It seems that they worshipped some of the same gods of the Greeks and the Romans, and that the Etruscans changed the names of the Greek gods, and then the Romans adopted more of the Etruscan name when they adopted elements of the Greek pantheon. There are some differences, though, between the Greek religion and the Etruscan religion, namely in their understanding of death. The Etruscans have two gods of death. They have Aita, god of death, who's similar to the Greek god Hades. He's married to a woman or goddess named Persephone, basically the Etruscan version of Persephone. Again, we talked about the Greek gods in the archaic Greek lecture video if you want reminders about who the Greek gods were. They also worshipped a being called Aplu, who is Apollo, and Artemi, who is basically Artemis. They have two gods of death. Aita is meant to show the more positive elements of death, whereas Kalu was the god of the more negative and frightening elements of death. And he's not really depicted in Etruscan art and sculpture. And the image on this slide is of Aplu, or of Apollo, and it's made in the Orientalizing style in about 500 BCE. So now we'll talk about Etruscan temples, the buildings in which they would have worshipped their gods and goddesses. There are some similarities between Greek temples and Etruscan temples. Scholars debate how much of Etruscan temples was copied from the Greeks. Some scholars even argue that the Greeks actually copied elements from the Etruscans. It's hard to say for sure because there's not many surviving examples of Etruscan temples. Really, most of what we have is just their foundations. The Etruscans built their temples primarily out of wood and out of clay, with some stone, mostly in the foundation. So a lot of these temples would have been burnt to the ground, or they would have been replaced by later Roman temples. So much of what we know about Etruscan temples comes from documentary sources and what little archaeological evidence we have. On this slide are two reconstructions of Etruscan temples. We think that Etruscan temples were probably smaller, made of wood. They would have been raised off of the ground, which is probably a tradition left to the Etruscans by the Proto-Villanovan people. The columns on these temples were very simple. This is called the Tuscan order. If you look at the reconstructions, you can see it's somewhat similar to the Doric order, but there is no fluting, there's no grooves on the columns themselves. We do think that the Etruscan temples would become somewhat larger as they began to use like different types of stone, and as they presumably adopted more Greek elements of their culture into their culture. This is a foundation of an Etruscan temple. The foundations were called podiums, um, like a podium that a person would stand on today. This one is in Orvieto, Italy, and the temple itself has been lost, but the foundation is all that's left because it's made of stone. This is a reconstruction of what the Temple of Minerva, or Athena, the Romans and the Etruscans called her Minerva. This is in Veii, Italy, or would have been in Veii, Italy. These temples have large porches in the front where the religious rituals would have taken place. They would not have taken place inside the closed portion of the building, we think. But once again, we don't have a lot of examples of Etruscan temples because they were built mostly with wood. They did decorate the roofs of their temples, though, with ceramic figures of their gods. And we have some reconstructions that we can view to see what these ceramic figures would have looked like. You can see that the decorations are very, very intricate, but because they're made of ceramics as opposed to being made of a stone like marble, they get broken more easily. They're harder for archaeologists to find and reconstruct. The Etruscans used ceramic pottery as well. Very similar in style to Greek pottery. They used the red and the black figures talked about in previous videos. They decorated their pottery with designs from nature and scenes from their mythology. So in many ways, their pottery is very similar to that of the Greeks, and of course similar to the Romans later on. The Etruscans also made bronze sculptures, and their bronze sculptures are interesting. They do adopt elements of Greek and Roman styles later in their history. Early Etruscan bronze sculptures have what is probably a Villanovan influence. They're not as anatomically correct and realistic. Usually early on, they tended to portray gods and elite people. The bronze on the right-hand side of this slide is probably of Laren, their god of war, which would become Mars, the Roman god of war. And this is an image probably of a upper class or an elite man based on the type of clothing that he's wearing. And these, of course, are early Etruscan bronze sculptures. Etruscan bronze sculptures become more sophisticated with time. This is Menra, goddess of wisdom and war, becomes the Roman goddess Minerva. It's from this specific piece is from about the 400s or 450s BCE. These later Etruscan sculptures are from the 300s to the 200s BCE. And you can see a much more clear Greco-Roman influence on these sculptures. It's also possible the last sculpture, which is the sculpture of a boy. This may have actually been made after the Romans took control of Etruscan territory and began to force Roman culture on the Etruscans. The Etruscans gave many elements of their culture to the Romans, but in the end, the Romans began to give many of their elements of their culture to the Etruscans, albeit forcibly. So now we'll talk about Etruscan military weapons and armor based on what we've found as archaeologists. There seems to be a fusion of Greek military technology as well as Northern European, primarily Celtic military technology. These early Villanovan helmets definitely have a Celtic influence. The Villanovans liked to make these helmets with these sort of pointed crests, and the Celts early in their history liked to make helmets with points. Over time, the Etruscans begin to adopt more Greek-style weapons and armor. They used both bronze and iron to make weapons and armor. Iron, of course, is preferred for weapons like swords and spears. Oftentimes, armor is still made out of bronze, though. Bronze is softer and it's easier to make into complex shapes, but iron is much harder and will keep an edge a lot better. It's also believed that the Etruscans developed some of the best military footwear of the ancient world. They made very sturdy sandals, which we believe the Romans adopted for themselves when they created their own legions later in history. The Etruscans were certainly militarily formidable enough to take over Latin territory, or the future Roman people, the Latins, in the 700s to 500s, but over time, the Romans will conquer the Etruscans by about 265 to 264 BCE. And on this slide, you can see archaeological finds of Etruscan spear points made of bronze, and an Etruscan dagger. This example is actually made of bronze as well. And here is some early Etruscan or Villanovan armor, again made of bronze, although it's shown with a Greek-style hoplon round shield. Once again, seeing the fusion of Northern European and Mediterranean traditions in Etruscan armor. Here are some other weapons that were used by the Etruscans. They liked axes. This is a axe head, and here is what an Etruscan axeman may have looked like. They also used chariots. This is a Etruscan chariot. It's at a museum in Italy. Here are some artists' recreations of what Etruscan soldiers might have looked like. We see the varieties of armor they wore early on. You can see the Northern European influence in their armor. But by later points in Etruscan history, they're making much more Greco-Roman style hoplite armor with round shields, spears, helmets with crests. So you see over time the changes in Etruscan military culture and military technology. So we'll discuss the kind of the end of the Etruscan civilization. By about 265 to 264, Rome had expanded and taken control of the Etruscan territory in northern Italy, and it would take them about 200 years to acculturate, or rather replace Etruscan culture with Roman culture, to make the Etruscans Roman. They did this by forcing the Latin language on the Etruscan people, and by actually recruiting a lot of Etruscan men to serve in the Roman military. Here we see Roman senators presiding over Etruscan soldiers joining the Roman military. It's ironic because the later Roman authors often wrote about how the Etruscans were weak and decadent and hedonistic, but many Etruscan soldiers actually would serve in the Roman military in the 200s as both soldiers and sailors, particularly in the Punic Wars. We're going to discuss the Punic Wars in a future video. But here you can just see the armor that was used by the Etruscans there. Bronze armor, iron weapons, and you can see the sort of sandal-like shoes that they would have worn, which would have allowed their soldiers to have better protection for their feet, both on the march and in battle. So now we'll shift gears and we'll talk about the Romans' neighbors much further to the north, the Celts, or the Celtic peoples. So the Celts were not one single group. Rather, they were disparate groups or tribes of people who lived in northern and western Europe. It's believed that the Celts were a Indo-European people. The evidence suggests that they were descendants of Indo-European people who migrated from the east, from what is now Russia, and then settled in Western Europe and Northern Europe. These regions, of course, were a lot less lightly populated, so the Celtic cultures of about the 1500s BCE to about the time of Julius Caesar's takeover of Gaul. It's believed that these cultures had more of an Indo-European influence than cultures to the south, like the Romans and like the Greeks. The Indo-Europeans did invade southern Europe, but those areas had larger populations, so you saw cultural syncretism between Indo-European and then local cultures of the Mediterranean. We will say, though, scholars consider the Celts as a single group, even if they were disparate tribes, because that was how ancient peoples viewed them. The Greeks viewed the Celts as a single people, calling them the Keltoi, which means the tall people or the tall ones. And there's also major artistic, cultural, and linguistic similarities between the various Celtic tribes. They spoke similar languages, or the Celtic language, in various dialects. They had a similar culture that put a lot of emphasis on the family and on textile weaving and on metalworking. And they had similar religious beliefs. But there would have been, of course, some variation between, say, a Celtic person living in what is now Spain and a Celtic person living in what is now Switzerland or northern Italy. The Celts were major trading partners with the Greeks and with the Etruscans and the Romans, and they also fought against the Greeks and the Etruscans and the Romans. And as was the case with the Etruscans, many elements of Roman culture came from the Celts. Rather, the Celts introduced many elements, particularly military cultural elements, to the Romans, in the same way that the Etruscans introduced many cultural elements to the Romans. And of course, the Celts in their time were respected as warriors and hunters and as metalworkers and weavers. So we'll talk a little bit about Celtic society as seen by their settlements. The Celts didn't typically build large cities or settlements that could be considered cities by Childs' definition. These were more like large villages in many cases. But their villages are still small compared to even a village built in the Mediterranean region. The Celts built round houses with thatched roofs. The roofs, of course, are conical in shape. And these houses were big and designed to hold the entire family, suggesting sort of the tribal nature of the Celtic culture. By the way, when I say tribal, I don't mean that the Celts are primitive or that any tribal culture is primitive. Tribal cultures basically are cultures where groups of people are organized by families. And so when I say that the Celts are a tribal culture, I don't mean that they're backward. I mean that family was very important to the Celts. By the way, tribe is actually a Latin term, and tribe is often used to describe early Roman communities, which were based around family units. So these Celtic houses, they were built with local materials, wood, reeds for thatched roofs, and they'd use a little bit of stone and then mud and reeds, what's often called wattle and daub, to make the walls of their homes. So they're adapting to their environment in the way that other civilizations, like the Mediterranean civilizations, adapted to their environment. Larger settlements with bigger populations, they would build earthworks or walls called duns or dunes, depending on the Celtic dialect being used, which would have been used to protect larger communities. Here's some interiors of what Celtic houses would have looked like. They would have had a hearth in the center. They probably would have been very smoky on the inside, but people would have gone about their day and done work in these houses. Women would have worked as weavers at the loom, and men would have guarded the house, protected the house. Here we can see a dune wall around a Celtic settlement, just to give you the idea that these settlements would not be considered cities in terms of their population and in terms of criteria for cities, but some of them were large enough to need walls for defense. And these are some archaeological or architectural drawings of floor plans for Celtic roundhouses. Notice the hearths in the center of the home being very important. This ditch here may have been used possibly for defensive purposes, but more likely the ditch was probably used as a place to deposit trash and night soil and waste from the houses. So this ditch, technically in archaeological terms, is probably a midden. And of course, we talked about what middens were in the first and second video of this course. Middens, of course, are an archaeological term for trash pits. And these trash pits, while the thought of them seems very disgusting, they're very useful for archaeologists. We can learn a lot about people in the past based on their trash. We can learn what they ate, what they drank. If they used ceramics, we can learn if they were sick or if they had diseases. They're a treasure trove of information for archaeologists. So we should talk about Celtic language and writing. The Celts spoke an Indo-European language that was broken into several dialects. The Celts themselves, at the time that we're talking in this course, the ancient Celts, they did not have their own writing system. Rather, they had adopted and made some slight changes to the Greek and Latin alphabets. And they used these alphabets because they were trading with the Greeks and the Romans. So it's a trade-based culture in addition to being a military culture. Later Celtic peoples, more like medieval Celtic peoples, will develop their own alphabet and a more unique writing system. But that's happening more in the medieval period. So it's a bit beyond the scope of this course. The Roman conquerors would work to suppress the Celtic languages in Gaul, what is now France, but the language would not die out completely in continental Europe. For example, Breton, which is spoken in Brittany, basically the northwest coast of France, is a Celtic language. So the Romans were not able to completely eradicate the Celtic language on the European continent. And Celtic languages, of course, still exist in the British Isles. Scots Gaelic or Scottish Gaelic is a Celtic language. The original language of the Irish people is a Gaelic or Celtic language. Most people in Ireland and Scotland speak English today as their first language, but there has been an effort in recent years to teach people to speak these Celtic languages again so they will not be lost forever. The English, of course, like the Romans, had tried to encourage the Scottish and the Irish people, or rather forcibly encourage them to use English as part of their own acculturation process. So the Celts were very skilled weavers. They made clothing in a variety of colors and with a variety of patterns. And we can see this in their textiles and in their clothing. Most of the weaving work and the creation of cloth, the creation of clothing, even things like the dyeing of clothing with colors would have been done by women in Celtic society. We think that early on these colors would have denoted what tribal or community you were a part of as a Celtic person. And we can see vestiges of this today in modern Celtic cultures. Scottish people have tartans for patterns that symbolize what clan or what family they're a part of. And we think that the ancient Celts may have had a similar system. Women tended to wear long dresses with cloaks for warmth. Most of this clothing would have been made of wool, but they probably also made clothing out of linen as well, which comes from flax. Once again, Northern Europe is a lot colder than the Mediterranean, so their clothing was heavier, thicker. These cloaks were very important for warmth. Women wore much longer dresses than women in the Mediterranean did. Men actually wore trousers as well. Most Mediterranean males did not wear trousers. In fact, they thought that trousers were weird and strange. The Greeks didn't like trousers. They associated trousers with the Persians because a lot of the Persian subjects, particularly those that lived in colder mountainous areas, wore trousers. But the Celts wore trousers too. The Romans didn't like trousers either. They preferred to wear tunics and togas. Although sometimes Roman soldiers in later periods, if they were stationed in Gaul, northern France, or in Britannia, what is now England, they might wear Celtic-style trousers because they were just warmer in a cold environment. So once again, they're adapting to their environment. And also the Celts wore different types of clothing based on their gender, based on class, and based on the activity of the wearer. Wealthier Celts could afford nicer clothing. They could also afford armor. Poorer Celts might wear simpler clothing without complex patterns. And of course, Celtic clothing was gendered. Women wore long dresses, whereas men wore shorter tunics and trousers. Here's just some diagrams of some of the types of clothing that Celtic women would have worn. In addition to cloth, they might have worn fur as well. Fur, of course, would have been very warm for the winter, but it's also expensive. Here are some Celtic looms and examples of Celtic clothing that have been found. We haven't found many examples of ancient Celtic clothing that's complete. It just, cloth does not preserve as well as other materials. So much of what we know about Celtic clothing in antiquity comes from studying later Celtic cultures and then kind of extrapolating as archaeologists what ancient Celtic clothing might have looked like based on what medieval Celtic clothing might have looked like, or even later cultures like the Germanic people who had similarities with the Celts in their own culture. But again, women predominantly would have been the ones doing the weaving. This would have been considered women's work for the Celts. So we have some samples of Celtic cloth, and we get an idea of the sophisticated patterns, the vivid colors that are used. We don't often know exactly what these clothes would look like. There's not a lot of visual art of clothed people in the Celtic societies of antiquity. We do think from what, limited evidence we do have that they did like patterns, vivid colors, which the fragments we found indicate that is true. And a lot of the cloth samples we found, they come from Celtic tombs. The deceased were buried with clothing and with extra clothing that they could use in the afterlife. So, as is the case with many other ancient civilizations, studying the civilization's graves, you can learn a lot about the culture itself that produced them. Then now we'll talk about Celtic tombs. Celtic tombs vary somewhat by period and by location. The Celtic people were around for centuries, really for well over 1,000 years, and they controlled a vast amount of territory, or not controlled, but inhabited a vast amount of territory in northern Europe. But two of the most prominent types of tombs that the Celts had were earthen burial mounds. You can see one on the right-hand side of the slide, and then rectangular stone tombs that are called barrows. And these are made out of stone with some earth would have been used as well. We do see social stratification in Celtic tombs. Wealthy people, especially chieftains who would have been heads of tribes, have much larger tombs and they have a lot more grave goods. There's evidence that the Celts practiced secondary burial. Again, secondary burial is when a person is buried and their body decomposes and their bones are moved to another tomb. There's also evidence of human sacrifice around the tombs where people would be killed so that they could serve as servants for the deceased chieftain in the afterlife. We've found evidence of that among the Celts, and we've also found that later civilizations that were influenced by the Celts, various Germanic peoples, for example, also practiced this type of human sacrifice. The Celts practiced another type of human sacrifice as well, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the video. Here are some interiors of Celtic tombs. These examples are actually from Ireland, and the tombs themselves are fairly plain, but they did have carvings. The Celts invested more in the grave goods than in the tomb itself. Here you can see a bronze head that's made in an orientalizing style, highlighting the connections, the trade connections and intellectual connections that the Celts had with Mediterranean civilizations to the south. And of course, there's a piece of black figure pottery buried in a Celtic tomb as well. Some recreations of what Celtic burials or their tombs would have looked like. The deceased, especially if they were wealthy, they'd be buried with food, clothing. They might be buried with a wagon, with weapons. Wealthy men and wealthy women would be buried with grave goods. We think that the Celtic culture actually would have been somewhat more egalitarian in terms of gender by the standards of the day, and at least somewhat more egalitarian in terms of gender than, say, the Greeks and the Romans were, which their societies were highly, highly patriarchal. And oftentimes animals would be sacrificed and buried with the dead, and in some cases humans would be killed and buried with the dead, but this was rarer than animals being killed. Here's some actual Celtic human remains. We can see different types of grave goods. These are not the remains of wealthy people. They're buried with far fewer goods than a wealthy person would have been. Just some pottery and a sword scabbard, for example. Very, very simple burials compared to an elite person. So now we'll discuss the Celtic religion. There's strong European elements in the Celtic religion. Very similar, the Celtic religion is to later Germanic and Norse religions. The most important kind of Celtic god is the Dagda. He's sort of a father god, and he has a lot of similarities to Odin of Germanic peoples, or Woden of the Germanic peoples, and then of Zeus and Jupiter. Remember, I've argued that Zeus, the father of the Greek gods, or Jupiter, the father of the Roman gods, he bears more similarities to Indo-European father gods, like Odin and Woden, or in this case Dagda, than he does to Near Eastern or North African father gods. When you see religious art amongst the Celts, they portray their gods with very large heads and very small bodies. And these reliefs are usually made out of gold and silver. So they're not making their visual art of gods very, very realistic. Perhaps they're trying to capture more the elements and attributes these gods represent rather than an actual visual image of the gods, which of course is very different than how the Greeks and the Romans portrayed their gods as basically bigger, more powerful versions of humans. This is just an illustration of the family tree of the Celtic pantheon. As you can see, it's very, very complicated. Here you can see Dagda, their all-father god, and then you can see his various children that become other gods and goddesses. Bridget, for example, is sort of a female goddess of love, but also a female goddess of war, similar to like Aphrodite or Athena, better known as Venus and Minerva in the Roman case. The Celtic pantheon, of course, is very complicated, so we won't discuss it in more detail. But for those of you that are interested, this is the Celtic pantheon and family tree of the gods. Here's some more views of Celtic religious reliefs. The Celts were not as interested in portraying their gods very realistically, as if they were humans, but perhaps more in trying. They wanted to portray the attributes of these gods, what attributes they had, what these gods meant to them, as opposed to having them look like humans. So now we'll talk about the priests of the Celtic people, who are called the Druids. The Druid is actually from the Latin word druidei, which means oak seer. And Romans who studied the Celts or spent time amongst the Celts, like Julius Caesar, described many elements of the Celtic religion. While the Celtic religion was polytheistic, they had gods and goddesses, there's also very strong pantheistic elements in the Celtic religion, much more so than in the religion of the Greeks and the Romans. The Celts, priests, the Druids, they worshiped trees, especially oak trees, hence the name oak seer, and their temples and religious complexes were usually set up around trees. But the Druids were more than just priests. They were part of the Celtic nobility. They were said to be able to see the future. They were almost like the scientists and philosophers of the Celtic people, which is why they've often been portrayed similar to how Greek and Roman philosophers are portrayed. They would have worn white cloaks to separate them from everyday Celts who preferred to wear bright colors and patterns. It's also believed that women could be Druids as well, although there's some debate about this, whether the women described in documentary sources were actually Druids or if they were just ordinary Celtic women engaging in religious rituals. On a more negative side, the Druids did oversee human sacrifices. Although human sacrifice, while it did take place in the Celtic societies, it was fairly rare. And many of those who were sacrificed were criminals. That doesn't necessarily justify this, but it's just something to keep in mind. So now we'll discuss some of the people who were sacrificed by the Druids. Before that, though, I want to talk a little bit about Celtic temples. Celtic temples were usually either built from wood, like this rendering shows here. It features trees in the temple complex. The Celts also liked to perform rituals at older pieces of monumental architecture, various types of stone circles, which were built by people who lived in, especially in the British Isles before the Celts. Stonehenge was not built by the Celts. Stonehenge was probably about 2,000 years old by the time the Celts reached the British Isles. But later Celtic peoples would use Stonehenge for rituals. And other smaller kind of stone circles would be used for rituals as well, even if they've been built by earlier civilizations. Some of the sacrifice rituals. One is the Wicker Man. This is a much later, early modern depiction of the Wicker Man, in which people would be placed inside of a wooden and wicker skeleton, human skeleton, and then lit on fire. Sacrifices would be performed, as I mentioned, at Stonehenge. In general, it was criminals and people who had done things in life that were considered wrong who were sacrificed. Doesn't justify this, but it's just something to keep in mind. So now we'll discuss the bog mummies. These are probably the most famous of the Celtic sacrificial victims. We have two examples here on this slide. On the left is Cloney Cavan Man, found in Ireland. He probably died sometime between 392 and 201 BCE. Studies of his hair show that he had traces of Spanish pine resin in his hair, basically ancient hair gel, and a cosmetic item like this would have been very expensive, so this man was most likely a king or a chieftain. He also, the evidence shows that he ate well. He ate a very balanced diet, unlike a lot of other poorer people who would have eaten diets based much more heavily on grains. On the right here is not a complete articulated human body, but it's the torso of the old Krogan man, who probably lived and died sometime between 362 and 175 BCE, also in Ireland. It's believed that he, based on his wingspan or arm span, would have been about 6'6" in life, or 6 feet 6 inches in life, well over 2 meters tall. Autopsies performed on the remains show that both of these men were brutally killed and probably tortured and mutilated before they were buried in bogs. And a lot of these bogs might have been lakes at the time, but they became bogs as the centuries passed. The Celts probably were not trying to preserve the bodies. This just happened as a natural process from the peat bogs of northern Europe. They are very, very acidic, and that keeps away microbes that break down dead bodies, and it also keeps air out, so these bodies are well preserved. And of course, in the center, this is actually a facial reconstruction of what Cloney Cabin Man may have looked like in life, with his slick back hair with the pine resin. What we think is that the Celts, in rituals like this, they were sacrificing upper class people, possibly even their kings and chieftains. And they probably did this if there was a bad harvest, or if the tribe lost a war. Remember, these tribes were disparate groups. Sometimes they fought amongst each other, and basically you would sacrifice your leader because they'd done a poor job in leadership. Or, in the case of a famine, they hadn't done a bad job, but the assumption was the tribe was being punished with a famine by the gods, and therefore they had to offer up their chieftain as a sacrifice to get into good graces with their deities once again. These are actually not the best preserved bog mummies that are available. Some of the best preserved ones are in Denmark, but there's debate about whether those bodies were buried by Celtic people or by Germanic people. So I chose these two examples from Ireland, which are fairly well preserved, but not perfectly, or not as well preserved as others. So now we'll talk about Celtic weapons. The Celts were very skilled ironworkers and warriors. Swords were one of their favorite weapons. They made a variety of swords. They made a short, straight sword, like this one here, or this one. They also made curved swords. They're a little bit like scythes. These curved swords were probably made more in Eastern Celtic territories, like what is now Eastern Europe and the Balkans, whereas these straight swords were popular more in what is now France, or what was called Gaul by the Romans. And the Romans would have been more familiar with this type of sword. And it's believed that the Romans copied their short sword called the gladius off of Celtic short swords. But many other elements of Roman armor and equipment, military equipment, are similar to Celtic arms and equipment. And of course, the Celts used other weapons. They used axes, spears, ranged weapons like bows and arrows, and they used chariots as well. And their shields, they made a variety of types of shields, but they were usually oblong, either oblong and rectangular or oblong and oval shaped. And the Romans will make their shields oblong, like the Celts, rather than the Greeks, who preferred round, circular shields. Here's just some of the sword hilts we found amongst the Celts. You can see the level of sophistication in their workmanship. Just to highlight once again, the Celts were skilled ironworkers, and they also put a lot of emphasis on a warrior culture, a military culture. Here are some examples of other Celtic arms and weapons. We see here some spear points, and then a couple of examples of shields. These two shields here were probably more ornamental or ceremonial shields, whereas this shield here would have been used actually in battle. The shields were made of a variety of materials, usually wood, plated with some type of metal. Celtic helmets are very interesting. We can really see how the Celtic helmets would have influenced later Roman elements, or Roman helmets. This helmet here, with its cheek plates and neck guard, is very similar to the helmets worn by later Roman legionaries. And this helmet, by the way, is from 2 to 300 BCE. So this is the Celts influencing the Romans, not the Romans influencing the Celts. But the Celts also made very beautiful, really, ceremonial helmets. This helmet's from Agris, and this helmet's from Waterloo. This is from the 400s BC, and this is from the 150s BCE. This helmet has horns. We don't think that horned helmets would have been worn in combat. Not very practical. They are heavy, and they give an enemy something that they could grab, and then defeat their foe more easily by grabbing a horn. So horn helmets were probably worn more for ceremonial purposes, we think. Here are just some artists' reconstructions of Celtic warriors. Contrary to what a lot of films would have you believe, the Celtic warriors did not fight always naked or shirtless. Some certainly would have, especially light infantry, men who were lightly armed and who would move quickly around the battlefield. But wealthier men would have worn a lot more armor. They would have worn chainmail. It's believed that chainmail was actually a Celtic invention from about the 500s BCE, and they would have had, of course, oblong swords, and they would have had helmets with cheek plates and then with a neck guard in the back. So you can see a very, very clear Roman, or the Romans will really copy many elements of Celtic military technology. And of course, they used chariots as well. As I mentioned, not all Celtic warriors fought with no clothing on. Some might have, but this would have been more so they could move more quickly around the battlefield. Wealthy soldiers would have worn heavier armor and more clothing. The Celts did paint themselves with like blue paint. This is believed to have evolved as a way to either cover up or treat wounds. This paint may have actually been some type of medicine. But over time it became more decorative and associated with the Celtic culture. There's also evidence that the Celts, their warriors may have had tattoos also. The Celts also allowed women to serve as warriors. The most famous female warrior of the Celts is probably Boudica, who led a rebellion against the Romans in Britain in about the 60s CE. Also, male warriors often washed their hair in lime, which would have bleached their hair and given it sort of a grayish, whitish, blonde look. It also would have made it look a lot spikier, which would have made them look taller and more intimidating. They also would have grown long mustaches as well, again, to look more intimidating. So because the Celts were very skilled warriors, one tribe of Celts, led by Brennus, was able to defeat the Romans at the Battle of Allia. Now, Brennus outnumbered the Romans by nearly 2 to 1. By the way, Brennus also, this is Brennus who attacked the Romans. Another Brennus, about 100 years later, would invade Greece. So don't want to get those two terms confused, those two names confused. So the Roman army's defeat after the Battle of Allia opened Rome up for destruction and sacking by the Celts. After sacking Rome, Brennus was eventually driven out of Italy by Roman general Camillus. So he sacked Rome, but did not completely conquer the Romans. The Romans would rebuild their city, and they would rebuild with larger, thicker walls. But this sacking did lead to increased anti-Celtic xenophobia in Roman culture. And the Celtic sack of Rome would inspire later Roman wars against the Celts. And this is an image of Celts and hoplites fighting. Romans often wore Greek-style armor at this point in their history, in the late 300s BCE. Over time, they're going to develop their own armor, often by using Celtic military technology, which you'll see in later videos. Some scenes from the Battle of Allia and after. Brennus went to the gates of Rome, and the Romans tried to placate him by giving him gold. And Brennus was said to say, "Be victus," to the victor go the spoils, and took the gold and then destroyed the city anyway. So it's said that he captured Rome through treachery, not through sheer military strength. Again, the impact of the Celtic sack on Rome. Roman society was already militaristic at the time of the Celtic invasion and sacking, but the Romans became more militaristic afterwards. They built thicker walls for the city of Rome. They adopted elements of the Celtic military, the people who had defeated them. These oblong shields, helmets with cheek plates and neck guards, short swords like the gladius. Increased elements of anti-Celtic xenophobia also became common, and these would culminate with Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul, Celtic territory in what is now France, and then the Emperor Claudius's conquest of Britain Celtic territory, and of course what is now England. So we'll finish this video by discussing Rome's neighbor to the south, the Carthaginians. And the Carthaginians did not have the kind of cultural influence on the Romans that the Etruscans or the Celts did. But they're still an important civilization. Rome's conflicts with the Carthaginians had a major impact on the development and the course of Roman civilization. We'll discuss the wars between the Romans and the Carthaginians in a future video. But in this video, I want to talk a little bit about Carthaginian culture. So the Carthaginians, they established their city in Carthage, what is now Tunisia, in about 814 to 813 BCE. The city was said to be founded by a woman named Elisa, who would become the basis for the later Roman legend of Dido. We'll talk about Dido in a moment. The Carthaginians, like the Phoenicians, who were their forebears actually, they were very skilled seafarers. They were good sailors. They were good maritime merchants. But unlike their Phoenician founders, the Carthaginians were a lot more warlike. And they built an empire in the Western Mediterranean that spread across North Africa, Western North Africa, and then northward into Iberia, what is now Spain, and even into Sicily and parts of other northern Mediterranean islands. These are, of course, symbols of the Carthaginian civilization, a sailing vessel, and then this is a stele featuring the goddess Tanit, or the symbol for the goddess Tanit, who was a major goddess in the Carthaginian Phoenician religion. And of course, there's an inscription to Tanit written in the Phoenician alphabet down here. This is the Carthaginian Empire. As you can see, it spreads across Western North Africa and then into Spain, and even for a period, they control both Corsica and Sardinia and about half of Sicily. Rome at this point is a fairly minor civilization. They have taken over or are working on taking over the Etruscan Empire, but they're mostly confined to the Italian peninsula at this point. The Carthaginians expanded into Spain and maintained territory in Spain largely because there were silver mines in Spain, particularly around Gades or Gadir, which is near the modern Spanish city of Cadiz. And of course, this silver mining, along with their maritime trade, like the Phoenicians, they produced purple dye. Things like silver, purple dye, they made the Carthaginian civilization, Carthaginian Empire, very wealthy. And after the ancestral cities of the Phoenicians are destroyed, Carthage remains the last vestige of the Phoenician civilization, although the Carthaginians were much more warlike than their Phoenician forebears. There's shipwrecks of Carthaginian ships across the Mediterranean, so we have a good idea of the kind of goods they were carrying and just how much overseas trade they were involved in, maritime trade they were involved in. They were also very skilled explorers. We think that the Carthaginians reached Ireland and Britain and explored those areas. Some even think that the Carthaginians may have sailed all the way around Africa, or they think the Phoenicians completed that voyage. There's some debate as to whether they actually completed that voyage. And there's also some who think that the Carthaginians maybe even sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, although that seems very unlikely in my opinion. I don't think their sailing ships, sophisticated as they were for the time, would have been strong enough to sail across the Atlantic Ocean. I'll briefly touch on the legend of Aeneas and Dido. Dido was probably based on Queen Elisa, who was a real historical figure. Dido herself, though, the chronology is not accurate historically or archaeologically. So this is a myth or a legend created by the Roman poet Virgil much later in history as a way to explain the long-term rivalry between the Carthaginians and the Romans in what were called the Punic Wars, or the wars with Carthage. Punic, of course, being the Latin term for Carthaginians. Aeneas of Troy was said to be the founder of the Roman people. He fled Troy after it was destroyed by the Greeks in about the 1200s BCE, and then he met Dido and had a relationship with her, but then went on to the Italian peninsula to found the people who would become the Romans. Dido became very sad and angry that Aeneas left her, and because of that, the Carthaginians and the Romans were said to have been long-standing rivals because of this sort of ruined relationship, a spurned lover in Dido. Historically speaking, this story doesn't make sense. Carthage was not established until the 800s BCE, whereas Troy, or at least the Troy of Aeneas, was destroyed in the 1200s BCE, so 400 years too early. But this myth is still useful because it explains Roman culture and how the Romans tried to explain their rivalry and their war against the Carthaginians, which will be the subject of future videos. So now that we've discussed the legend of Dido and Aeneas, we'll discuss Carthaginian religion. It's a polytheistic religion. They have multiple gods, like the Phoenicians and like so many other ancient Mediterranean civilizations. The Carthaginian religion was also culturally syncretistic. It had elements of North African, Near Eastern, and even European traditions. This is the goddess Tanit, the wife of their god Baal or Baal. These are probably the most important deities to the Carthaginians. These are Phoenician gods. So it makes sense that the Phoenician gods are the most important in their pantheon. There's also evidence to suggest that Carthaginian society was less patriarchal than other ancient Mediterranean civilizations. Women featured prominently in Carthaginian religious rituals, particularly as priests. The Carthaginians, on a more negative side, did practice human sacrifice, particularly of infants and young children. That's been something that's been debated by scholars for many years. For many years, they said that human sacrifice was something that happened. Then for a while in the mid to late 20th century, they said that it was made up by Roman and Hebrew writers as a way to make the Carthaginians and the Phoenicians look bad. Basically, it was a form of propaganda. More recent archaeological discoveries, however, have corroborated that human sacrifice, particularly child sacrifice, did take place. And some elements of the Carthaginian religion would survive even after Carthage was destroyed. They would survive as late as the 300s CE. So now we'll discuss some of the archaeological evidence for Carthaginian child sacrifice. We found cremated remains of children and infants, alongside inscriptions saying that the children had been offered to the gods. Some tried to argue that these sites, which were called tophets or tophets, were actually just cemeteries where deceased children were buried after being cremated. Their ashes would be put into jars like this, and ashes with animal bones or burned animal remains have been found also. These sites have been found throughout the Carthaginian Empire. Studies done on the cremated human remains suggest these were healthy children who died, so they did not die of natural causes, which would go along with ancient documentary sources which said that the Carthaginians engaged in child sacrifice. Some more points about the Carthaginian religion and about child sacrifice. This is Baal Haman, kind of the sort of the king of the Carthaginian pantheon, somewhat similar to Zeus, but with some differences as well. He is the husband of Tanit. He's one of the gods that would have received child sacrifices. Here is a child sacrifice stele that commemorates the sacrifice of a child. There's the symbol of Tanit, and then there's an inscription in the Phoenician language. Some people tried to argue that this was basically just a gravestone or a tombstone, but more recent scholarship believes that these were sacrificial victims who were killed to honor the gods. Here are a collection of the stelae that would mark those that were sacrificed. Before 1935, a lot of scholars believe the Carthaginians offered their infant and child sacrifices to a deity called Moloch or Molech, which Molech is a Hebrew term actually that was used by the Greeks and Romans. Nowadays, scholars think that Molech may have been more of a technical term for human sacrifice or child sacrifice. And there's debate over whether sacrificial victims were killed before their bodies were burned or if they were burned alive. Some documentary sources suggest that they were burned alive. Others are less clear, so we don't really know for sure. Here's some other Carthaginian religious artifacts that highlight the cultural syncretism of their religion. Here in the center is a statue to the Egyptian goddess Sekhmet, who had the head of a lion or a cat, but was also worshipped by the Carthaginians. The statue's in a Carthaginian style. It's not in an Egyptian style. And it was found near Carthage. This is a mask. It's called a sardo mask. These were masks that were used for religious rituals in the island of Sardinia. By the way, the term sardonic comes from sardo. Sardonic, of course, meaning having a happy expression about something that is bad. And this is a sarcophagus of a priestess. And you can see the similarities between the garb of a Carthaginian priestess and Egyptians, particularly in the clothing and the headdress that she is shown to be wearing. Carthaginian architecture, fairly plain compared to Greco-Roman architecture. They did build arches. These arches were used for structural purposes, and also arch-shaped roofs would have been useful to the Carthaginians. They would have provided shade in a very hot North African climate. Some of these sacrificial sites would have been covered over with arch-shaped roofs. Additional examples of Carthaginian architecture. In the back are some later Greco-Roman columns. There's a foundation of Carthaginian buildings. They usually built their buildings in a square or rectangular shape, a lot more like buildings in the Near East. I'll show some reconstructions of what their buildings would have looked like on a future slide. Here is a construction of Carthage before it was destroyed by the Romans. The Romans will destroy the city of Carthage, and then they will rebuild it in a Greco-Roman style later. But this is what Carthage looked like pre-Roman destruction. You can see very rectangular, box-shaped buildings. Although they do build a very elaborate harbor. This is an artificial harbor, which is called a kothon or kothon. They put a lot of effort into building this harbor because they're a seafaring maritime people. They have lots of trade ships and they have a large navy. So a harbor like this is essential for their civilization's economic and military success. This is reconstructions of what may have been a shipyard / naval base inside of the Kothon. Once again, highlighting the skill that the Carthaginians had, both as sailors and as shipbuilders. These are some archaeological finds from Gadir, also known as Gades. This is in what is now Cadiz, Spain. The Carthaginians sometimes buried their dead, their wealthy dead, in sarcophagi like these. These have some similarities to Egyptian sarcophagi, once again highlighting the syncretism of Carthaginian society. Here you can see the foundation of some Carthaginian homes in Gadir. Gadir was a silver mining town, so actually a lot of the residents would have been fairly wealthy because of the mining that was taking place in their city. Here's some columns, Greco-Roman style columns from later on. The Romans inhabited a lot of Carthaginian cities and sites after they conquered the Carthaginian Empire. So we'll talk about Carthaginian burial rituals briefly. Carthaginians like to bury their dead with seashells or with seashell jewelry. Wealthier people might be buried with a necklace like this one with seashells. The seashells would have highlighted the maritime nature of their culture, the importance of seafaring. Also, the purple dye that had made the old Phoenician Empire very wealthy was made from seashells, from a mollusk. So it's sort of a nod to their seafaring, but also to their trade. Poorer people would have been buried just with seashells. Wealthier Carthaginians, in addition to having sarcophagi, they also would have had mausoleums. These mausoleums have some similarity, I think, to Persian-style mausoleums in the sense that they're built kind of almost like step pyramids with multiple levels. This one is actually built in what is now Tunisia, and it was built for a elite person who died in the region and who could afford to hire several laborers to build the mausoleum for him. This is a reconstructed version of the mausoleum. When it was first discovered, it looked like this. The upper section had fallen apart. So, conclusion. The neighboring peoples of Northern Europe and of the Mediterranean and the Italian peninsula heavily influenced Roman culture and the course of Roman civilization. The Etruscans, the first civilization we talked about in this video, they brought many elements of Greek culture, secondhand Greek culture, to the Romans, especially when it came to architecture, dress, and religion. The Celts introduced a lot of military technologies to the Romans, and they made Roman society more militaristic, as seen during their invasion of Roman territory and their sacking of Rome in about 378 BCE. And the Carthaginians, while the Romans did not take as many cultural elements from the Carthaginians were major territorial rivals for the Romans. Both were trying to build empires in the Mediterranean, and that led to a series of wars called the Punic Wars, which were wars in which the Romans ultimately prevailed, and the Punic Wars were a major turning point in early Roman history. But we'll talk more about the Punic Wars in future videos.